welcome to Migration in the Americas, Confronting Violence with the Power of Active Nonviolence. This is the fourth in a series of online roundtables on nonviolence at the heart of the gospel and at the core of the mission of the Catholic Church. My name is Marie Dennis. I am the Senior Director of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, a project of Pax Christi International. I was co-president of Pax Christi International from 2007 until 2019, and I worked for the Maryknoll Missioners for almost 25 years. It is a delight to have you all with us. Thank you. Pax Christi is a global Catholic network of over 100 organizations on 6 continents, rooted in their local realities and working for justice, peace, and reconciliation. Many of you have participated in our programs. As part of our work, we have created the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which has organized this webinar, as well as others on Latin America and the Caribbean, on Asia Pacific, and on Africa. To begin our time together, could we ask you, Cardinal Ramazzini, to just lead us in a very brief opening prayer, if that is possible for you where you are?
Bueno, en el nombre del Padre, y del Hijo, y del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Dios, Padre nuestro, que enviaste a Jesús, el Señor, a este mundo, Él es el camino, la verdad y la vida. Queremos ahora tomar conciencia de reunirnos en su nombre, para que así se cumpla la promesa que Él nos dio, de estar en medio de nosotros. Que lo que digamos, que lo que discutamos, que lo que reflexionemos, sea en bien de tantas personas que necesitan apoyo y ayuda, sobre todo quienes están saliendo de sus países por diferentes razones, y que este encuentro que vamos a tener nos aliente y nos dé fuerza para seguir en este trabajo en el que nos sentimos plenamente comprometidos. Que para ti, Padre, sea hoy y siempre todo honor y toda gloria en la unidad de tu Hijo Jesucristo y del Espíritu Santo, por los siglos de los siglos. Amén.
Amen. Gracias. Thank you very much, Cardinal Ramazzini. Again, welcome to all of you. The point of this webinar is to focus on concrete experiences that illustrate the power of nonviolence in the context of migration in the Americas. Nonviolence is not often associated with migration and immigration. More often, we hear about the tremendous violence forcing people to move and the violence encountered by migrants on every step of their journey. Or tragically, we're told that migrants themselves are a threat to the communities where they hope to settle. We believe, however, that migration itself is a form of nonviolent resistance, and that reflecting together on the concrete examples of the nonviolent practices of migrants and their allies can help lend dignity to those who are migrating and enhance or even extend the effectiveness of accompaniment and solidarity. To set the context for our conversation, we will consider some examples of the violence that migrants in the Americas have encountered that caused them to migrate, or that they may have met on the journey. Then we will reflect on the many different expressions of nonviolence and how nonviolence is often woven into that journey. All of you around this virtual table are either migrants or part of the Catholic community of allies who accompany migrants so often. We invite you to reflect on your own experiences and on the stories you have heard from migrants. We hope this will contribute to a rich process and to a deeper understanding of transformational nonviolence. In all of this, we have been inspired by Pope Francis, who has called the world to follow the way of nonviolence, as when he said, to be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence, and in the most local and ordinary situations, and in the international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships, and our actions, and indeed of political life in all its forms. And may we make active nonviolence our way of life. We are deeply grateful for the presence and the participation of each of you. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing each of you who are present. In different ways, you represent the Church, the Catholic community, already deeply concerned about the global reality of massive displacement as it is occurring, particularly in the Americas. Welcome first to Cardinal Alvaro Ramazzini, who has served as bishop in the Diocese of San Marcos and the Diocese of Huehuetenango in Guatemala. He was Secretary General and later President of the Guatemalan Episcopal Conference and served as head of social pastoral care, of National Caritas, of the Pastoral Ministry and Communications, of the pastoral care of prisoners, and of Movilidad Humana. Cardinal Ramazzini played an important role in promoting peace during Guatemala's long civil war. He contributed to the National Reconciliation Commission and gave strong support to the communities affected by gold mining, particularly in San Marcos. He has chaired SICSAL, the Servicio Internacional Cristiano de Solidaridad con los Pueblos de America Latina, Oscar Romero, and the Episcopal Secretariat of Central America. Cardinal Ramazzini is a member of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America and was named a cardinal in 2019. Carla Aguilar is the manager and member of the executive coordination of CAMI, the Migrant Pastoral Support Center in São Paulo, Brazil, which was founded in 2005 to promote the human rights of immigrants and refugees, raising awareness in Brazilian society about the values of inclusion and solidarity. Carla has over 20 years of experience working with the Catholic Social Pastoral for Migrants in São Paulo. Welcome, Carla. Ken Budigan is Professor of Practice in Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program at DePaul University. He has worked in a series of movements for social change, including campaigns addressing homelessness, nuclear weapons, freedom for East Timor, and the U.S. wars in Iraq. In the 1980s, Ken was a founder and national coordinator of the Pledge of Resistance. He is a strategy consultant with Pace Bene Nonviolence Service, which has trained tens of thousands of people in the power of nonviolent change, and he serves on the executive committee of Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Heidi Cerneka, who is with us, has been a Maryknoll lay missioner since 1996. From 1996 until 2014, Heidi lived and worked in São Paulo, Brazil, where she served with both the National Prison Pastoral Ministry and the Instituto Terra, Trabajo y Ciudadanía, the Institute for Land, Work, and Citizenship. After earning her law degree in 2017, Heidi served in Kenya, engaging with local organizations in Mombasa and Nairobi. She's now living on the US-Mexican border, working with Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and with the ITTC in São Paulo to address human trafficking of migrant women in different forms. Leo Guardado, I don't think Leo is with us yet, but he expects to come as soon as he's finished with his class, is an assistant professor of theology at Fordham University. He was born in Chalatenango, El Salvador, but the Civil War forced him and his mother to migrate to Los Angeles, California, where he grew up from the age of 9. After studies, Leo worked ecumenically in Tucson, Arizona, with churches, dioceses, and non-governmental organizations, collaborating strategically across theological and political differences with communities committed to providing a humanitarian and pastoral response to persons in the process of migration. I don't know if Sister Philo Herota has joined us yet either. I'll introduce Sister Philo a bit later. Carlos Merentes, welcome Carlos, is the director of the Centro de los Trabajadores Agrícolas Fronterizos in El Paso, pardon my pronunciation. He founded the Border Agricultural Workers Project to organize farm workers, especially chile pickers, in the fields and in their communities on both sides of the US-Mexico border. Carlos has addressed the oppression of farm workers, climate change, and new models of food production and consumption. He was one of 3 people selected from the United States to take part in the World Meeting of Popular Movements at the conference at the Vatican. The conference was an open discussion about poverty, unemployment, loss of homes and land that affect people around the world. Padre Ismael Moreno, SJ, Father Melo, is also with us. Padre Melo is a Jesuit priest and a human rights defender from Honduras, where he is director of Radio Progreso and of ERIC, the Equipo de Reflexión, Investigación y Comunicación, the team for reflection, research, and communication, which litigate cases of human rights violations before national and international courts and conduct research, trainings, and strategic communication through community radio and printed materials on the human rights situation in Honduras. Padre Melo has frequently been threatened with death for supporting local communities daring to protect their land and water, and for denouncing human rights violations being committed frequently in Honduras. Sister Krista Parra is a member of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary and a 3rd-generation Mexican-American from a small border town in Arizona. She established Magnificat House in El Paso, Texas, and an inter-congregational, intercultural community, and is deeply involved in pastoral accompaniment at a shelter in Ciudad Juarez. Nicolas Paz works for Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. He was associate lecturer at the Department of Philosophy, the Pontifical University of Salamanca, and is a civil mediator with 10 years of experience. He's a member of the European Radicalization Awareness Network to prevent violent extremism. I don't know if Analia is with us yet either. Perhaps we could do the view of everyone so we can see who's here. I'm going to do that, excuse me. Great, thank you. Jean Stoken is Justice Coordinator for Immigration and Nonviolence for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. Her work includes policy advocacy, public witness activities, coalition initiatives with immigrant-led organizations, and engaging grassroots faith organizations on these issues. For over 30 years, Jean has led faith-based delegations to Central America and more recently to the US-Mexico border. I know she just returned from Honduras. And Scott Wright served for several years as the Director of Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Office of the United States region of the Missionary Society of St. Columban. He was focused on justice for immigrants and environmental justice. Scott worked in El Salvador for 8 years during the Civil War, first with Salvadoran refugees in Honduras, and then with pastoral teams accompanying Salvadorans in areas of conflict. During the past 30 years, Scott worked for faith-based advocacy organizations promoting human rights, democracy, and social justice in Central America. He also worked with survivors of torture as the advocacy coordinator for Task International. So welcome to all of you. Leo Guardado, it's nice to see you. Thank you. I introduced you a minute ago, so welcome to everyone. Nonviolence responds to the horrific violence in our world. It is a spirituality, a way of life, a global ethic, and a spectrum of tools for interrupting or preventing violence and for promoting just peace. But before we turn more fully to nonviolence, it is important that we have a sense of the violence that confronts people who are migrating. To gain a sense of this, we're grateful to have with us, as I said, Jean Stoken and Scott Wright, who will provide us with a brief overview. Welcome, Jean and Scott.
Thank you so much, Marie, Annapolis Christi International and the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative for organizing this roundtable. And we really want to affirm the voices from the Global South that are on this panel. And so just going to offer a bit of context. In the first slide, just an image to ground us in the reality. And it's just a picture from our trip there in June at the US-Mexico border, the encampment on the Juarez side where people are living for very long periods, prevented from coming to the US. Just to say that people have the right to migrate and people have the right not to migrate, to be able to live in conditions of dignity so that you're not forced to flee for your lives. There's a poem that begins with the line, "One does not leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark." And the next slide. And apologies for my voice, I returned sick. But when the question is asked, why are people fleeing? What are the root causes? The answer is usually poverty and violence. And it's more the top half of this triangle. And all of that is true. Yet a deeper question is, why is there poverty and violence? And how have the policies of the global North created the very conditions of violence and poverty from which people are fleeing for their lives? So by naming those policies, our hope is to challenge the anti-immigrant rhetoric and to shift the narrative, to shift it away from blaming the victims, immigrants and refugees, and instead accept responsibility for the role of the North in creating the conditions of desperation and violence. So in the bottom there, you see unjust trade agreements. I mean, the violence of trade policies that destroy economies of the South, an extractivist model of development, grabbing land from farmers to give to agribusiness. So the next slide. And I'm speaking now from the US. Just look at the number of US military interventions to keep these dynamics in place, supporting militaries of the South where repression is used to crush social movements who dare stand up and demand their rights. And on the left side, you see a few countries, and we're going to focus on just on Honduras, where it says there was a coup in 2009. And again, we're just back days ago, but Father Melo will surely have more to say. So a coup opened the doors to massive corruption of the state, to drug cartels, to human rights violations by security forces. The US blessed the coup in effect, and this was during the Obama administration. For the next 12 years, Honduras became a furnace of violence, driving out migration. Some 200 estimated land and water protectors have been killed for defending their lands and their territory since that coup. In the next slide, this is an emblematic case in Honduras of the Guapinao water protectors, a community for the last 5 years who've been protesting the poisoning of their river by an iron ore mine, which was given as an illegal mining concession to the richest family in the country by the post-coup government. Water defenders have been persecuted, arrested, 900 days, some of them spent in pre-trial detention just for non-violently protesting. And then there's the assassinations. The man in the middle with the microphone is Reynaldo Dominguez, a dear friend who is one of the key leaders. His brother, another water defender, was killed in this past January. And in June, his second brother was killed, water defender. He is constantly receiving threats. The day after the second water defender was killed, his brother, his family, and 42 extended family left. The trauma of living under that kind of threat. And when we were just in Guapinol again last week, and we heard 60 more people are on the migrant route north. They just could not take it any longer. So the next slide. Just want to say, I mean, that's our image of a prophetic church. Archbishop Romero, now a canonized saint. 6 weeks before he was assassinated, he wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter and said, please do not fund this government of El Salvador that's killing its people. The President Jimmy Carter and the subsequent presidents did not listen. Up to $1.5 million per day for the next 12 years was spent for this civil war. 75,000 killed, a third of the population displaced. What if our presidents listened to Archbishop Romero? What if the US weighed in instead of supporting the coup in 2009? I'll turn it to Scott.
Thank you, Jean. In our delegation to Honduras, it was in part to commemorate the life of Father Guadalupe Carne, a US Jesuit who 40 years ago was disappeared and assassinated for his commitment to social justice. And we returned to those communities where he worked in Honduras. And the question we asked people was, has anything changed for you for the better or for the worse in these 40 years? And the answer we heard was quite striking, and I think represents not only Honduras, but many countries throughout Latin America. The one thing they said that had changed was migration. They said, without access to land and genuine land reform, we cannot feed our families. There is no food security. Without access to clean water and the cancellation of concessions to mining companies, there is no life. Water is life. Impoverishing and displacing the poor is a form of violence. Extracting wealth for profit and destroying creation is also a form of violence. We see two models of development in conflict, one that favors private investment, profit, and extraction of natural resources, and the other that favors the common good and the protection of the environment. The global extractive economy that we saw and heard about that the US is supporting in Latin America is driving migration and leading to a humanitarian catastrophe on the US-Mexico border. A story. Some years ago, in a meeting on migration, a participant from Mexico said the following: we must not refer to the massive movement of migrants as caravans, but as an exodus. That's an invitation to change the narrative and the way we think about migration. By viewing migration as a form of nonviolent resistance connected to nonviolent social movements in their countries of origin, struggling to defend their lands and rivers, we make an important connection. Migrants are the face of those social movements that the Archbishop Romero and the Church have defended for so many years and that express hope for the future. Migrants invite us to a deeper solidarity with those nonviolent social movements for profound transformations in their countries. And I'll close with this. It was amazing to see in Honduras just 1 week ago how present Oscar Romero, and now Saint Romero, continues to be and exert such a powerful presence in this day and throughout the world. In our visit, just as an anecdote, I remember seeing a campesino wearing a t-shirt, and it had this picture of Romero, and beside it, these words that Romero said: hay que cambiar de raíz todo el sistema. We must change the very roots of this system of social injustice. It all comes back, as Jean said, to root causes, to US policies and interventions in the region, and to a global extractive economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you, Jean. That the tragic list of violences we know is only the tip of the iceberg, and you all know that very, very well. We will come back to a lot more conversation about how nonviolence connects with migrant experience, but we thought that it might be helpful first to have just a very brief overview of the fact that nonviolence, properly understood, is multidimensional, powerful, and essential to faithful discipleship. So Ken Budigan will give us a brief introduction to nonviolence in general, and Nicholas Paz, who also works with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, will begin our reflection on how nonviolence is woven into the journey of migrants everywhere. And I would particularly invite you, as you listen to Jean and Scott, and then Ken and Nicholas, to think particularly about your own stories, about what you have heard, and where you have seen a connection between nonviolence and the journey of migrants. So thank you, Ken.
First slide. Greetings, everyone. Second slide. In his most recent book, Pope Francis quoted Dr. Martin Luther King saying, "It is no longer a question of choosing between violence and nonviolence, but between nonviolence and non-existence." Then His Holiness added, "The choice is up to us." This is a very stark choice we as church and as humanity have to make. And this webinar is helping us look at that choice, especially in light of the violence that so many migrants around the world face. It is interesting that Pope Francis did not say that the choice is between peace and non-existence, though I'm sure he would agree with that. Instead, he agreed with Dr. King that what is required is an even sharper term, an even clearer term, a term that is necessary for all the things we cry out for: peace, justice, dignity, survival of the planet, survival of the human family. For this, His Holiness reached out for this term, nonviolence. In this same spirit, in this webinar, we also reach out for this term, for what can be called the wisdom tradition of nonviolence in Catholicism, in Christianity, and in all of humanity's history. In this time of great promise and great peril, especially as we grapple with the harrowing crisis of migration that at least 100 million people are experiencing at this very moment. The peace we long for, and that Pope Francis has relentlessly called us to, hinges on a nonviolent path that includes nonviolent struggle, nonviolent approaches, nonviolent teaching, nonviolent formation, and nonviolent action that includes the theology and practice of gospel nonviolence. This is not easy. It is risky, as we have heard already about the violence that people who have stood for justice in Latin America and around the world face every day. So to anchor our discussion of Catholic voices confronting violence with active nonviolence, let's take a moment to gain a sense of what we mean by nonviolence. Next slide, please. Nonviolence is a modern word for the ancient principle of refusing to harm. One of its roots is the word ahimsa that Gandhi drew on to describe what he was trying to do to end the colonial violence of British oppression in India. Next slide. Nonviolence means a decision not to use violence. But what it really means is the power that comes from the refusal to harm others. The power that is unleashed when we don't use the approaches that we're often taught to deal with conflict or violence. Those approaches include avoiding the conflict, appeasing the oppressor, being aggressive, or attacking. A spiritual power can come when we refuse these typical approaches, which are often a form of power over and seeking to dominate. The refusal to harm and the refusal to retreat, to go along with or use violence in any form, can often open the space for an alternative, for bringing the different pieces of the truth together, for healing ourselves and even our enemy, for reaching more unity and more reconciliation, for reclaiming our foundational unity, that we are all, in spite of everything, brothers and sisters. Next slide, please. Nonviolence, then, is the creative power of love and action, opposing violence, transforming conflict, fostering dignity, restoring justice, building peace, and cultivating the potential for reconciliation, all without violent means. And if we were just to look for one phrase, we could say, in short, nonviolence is no to violence and yes to full humanity. Next slide, please. Jesus deepened this ancient principle in his life and teaching. He taught his disciples to love their enemies and to turn the other cheek. When he stopped her accusers from stoning the woman caught in adultery, when he called us to be peacemakers, when he defied the Sabbath laws to heal the man with the withered hand, when he confronted the powerful at the temple and purified it, and when, on the night before he died, he told Peter to put away his sword, Jesus marked the path of nonviolence. Next slide, please. Jesus called us to love our enemies, as Angie O'Gorman puts it, quote, by which he meant wanting wholeness and well-being and life for those who may be broken and sick and deadly. It was meant to be the cornerstone of an entirely new process of disarming evil, one which would decrease evil instead of feeding it as violence does. Next slide, please. So, in light of all of this, we can say that nonviolence is a spirituality, a way of life, a method for change, and a universal ethic at the core of the gospel, putting down the sword, overcoming evil with good, and combining the rejection of violence with the power of love for all. Next slide. So nonviolence is a spirituality that includes reconciliation, empathy, solidarity, unity, and especially courage, the kind of courage we're hearing about for our sisters and brothers who are seeking the fullness of life. rooted in the life of the God of peace and nonviolence, the God who wants all of us, to live this nonviolent life. Next slide, please. Nonviolence is a way of life. This includes formation, practices, and communities for this nonviolent path, including respect, constructive communication, inclusivity, active participation, and interconnectedness. Next slide, please. But it's also a method for change, structural change, dramatic systemic change, so needed in this world, as we've been hearing. It's a spectrum of effective, nonviolent, cross-cutting approaches for preventing or ending violence, for transforming conflict, for protecting human and earth communities, and building a more just and peaceful world. Please, next slide. And finally, it is a universal ethic. It's the fullness of peace centered on nonviolence, an ethic that calls us to prioritize nonviolence in personal and societal decision-making. Close the slides, please. You can end the slides. So in this webinar, we are hearing the testimonies of those who have staked their lives on nonviolent possibilities, of nonviolence in action. No to violence, yes to the fullness of humanity, including those people we don't like very much, those enemies, those people who are driving this. We are finding alternatives to that. Or as Jesus has shared, combining the rejection of violence with courageous love. We will hear these testimonies of nonviolence and then together explore how the church could teach Catholics everywhere the nonviolence of Jesus, to support the human dignity of migrants and their nonviolent journey for their move to the fullness of life.
Thank you, Ken. And now Nicholas Paz will bring that closer to the migrant experience.
Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos. Es un honor y un placer estar con vosotros. Y hoy, bueno, mi presentación es más una invitación a una nueva, quizás a una manera de pensar la migración con una nueva lectura o como decía Scott, buscando esa nueva narrativa. Esta nueva lectura no pretende negar la violencia, el dolor ni el sufrimiento derivados de la mediación, pero sí acercarnos a la migración desde la mirada de la no violencia. Y en ese sentido, como digo, es solo el inicio de esta conversación y por mi parte esa invitación. Así, lo que presento es la idea de mirar la migración como el viaje que supone posiblemente en esta metáfora que comparto en esos, al menos esas tres etapas de la llamada a la salida y en tanto y por tanto la migración como un éxodo de la violencia que no es una huida, sino que exige de hecho una acción de coraje no violento frente a la violencia y asimismo una resistencia activa no violenta, además frente a múltiples violencias, porque esto no implica que cada migrante, digamos, realice ese éxodo desde un país violento o que está en un conflicto armado, sino que muchas veces también ese éxodo es de otras múltiples violencias, a veces de raíz más doméstica, como diría el propio Papa Francisco. Una segunda etapa que es el inicio de ese viaje, cuando esa travesía a través del desierto, pero que al mismo tiempo es un viaje de esperanza, de búsqueda de un nuevo hogar, al mismo tiempo que caminamos con el hogar que hemos dejado con nosotros. Y durante ese viaje, las múltiples, de nuevo, violencias que aparecen y cómo los migrantes y sus familias tienen que enfrentarse y resistirse a esas violencias durante el viaje y cómo esa resistencia, si es capaz de llevarse a cabo, se convierte en a pesar de todo el dolor y de todas las dificultades, en un proceso de humanización eh, que, bueno, pues que humildemente yo llamaba, ¿no?, llevar a Dios en el corazón también durante el viaje, ¿no? Llevar ese evangelio de la no violencia durante el viaje. Pero también en esa narrativa que conocemos de la violencia, eh, hay que poner quizás en valor en esa nueva lectura desde la no violencia a los que podemos denominar como los buenos samaritanos de la no violencia, que encontramos durante el viaje, ese Dios que camina con nosotros y que se encarna en esas personas que nos acompañan, a veces más tiempo, a veces una ayuda puntual, y también una reflexión sobre la migración, no solo como un viaje individual o familiar, sino cómo estamos asistiendo a un auténtico fenómeno, un viaje colectivo, ¿no? De migraciones del sur global al norte global, atravesando todas esas fronteras y muros humanos, y cómo podemos mirar a esa migración como el éxodo del pueblo de Dios que camina juntos. Y en esta invitación que hago ahora también a la reflexión, en esta tercera etapa, la llegada, ¿no? La acogida no violenta del migrante, eh, y también cómo en esa llegada que probablemente por mi experiencia también trabajando con familias, ni la narrativa sobre la migración acaba con la primera generación, sino que esa narrativa se va modulando, esa historia, ese éxodo se convierte en no solo colectivo, sino intergeneracional. Los migrantes de segunda y tercera generación siguen contando esa historia compartida, eh, y cómo, digamos, si hemos sido capaces de abrazar la no violencia del Evangelio, esto se convierte en nuestro hogar y cómo ha caminado con nosotros desde el principio, y cómo se ha ido, digamos, encarnando también en el nuevo hogar, porque de hecho ya venía con nosotros y está en nuestros corazones. Esta invitación que hago, eh, podemos quitar sí, la imagen. Esta invitación que hago, eh, la hago también sabiendo las dificultades y todas esas violencias de las que hablábamos al principio, pero para iniciar esta conversación que nos trae hoy aquí. Y si quizás esta nueva mirada, este nuevo intentar pensar la migración desde la no violencia puede darnos también quizás herramientas para actuar de manera no violenta frente a la migración. Muchas gracias y ahora también escucharé atento vuestras propias historias y reflexiones.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And now, really, we hope to hear from your experience, your stories, your perception of what are the connections between nonviolence and the journey of migrants, your own journey in many ways. Perhaps this doesn't make sense at all, or perhaps it does. This is a new question for many of us, and as others have said, possibly a way of understanding the migration process more deeply. So I would like to invite all of you to think about your experience, your personal experience, or about the stories that you've heard from others on the journey to bring to this conversation now. We have a good amount of time, so hopefully each of you will have an opportunity to share your thoughts, hopefully more than once. I'd like to begin with Cardinal Ramassini, perhaps inviting you to just respond to what you've heard about nonviolence, possibly about the practice of nonviolence by migrants and their allies. Is there a specific story that you would like to share where you've seen nonviolence in action during the process of migration, or just whatever you would like to share, Cardinal Ramassini?
Disculpe, cardenal, no le escuchamos.
¿Ahora me escucha?
Sí,
Perfecto,
gracias.
muchas gracias.
Yeah.
Sí.
Sí.
Sí, totalmente de acuerdo en lo que he escuchado, pero quisiera reafirmar lo que San Pablo VI decía, que una de las violencias más fuertes es precisamente la pobreza. Y en el caso de los migrantes, pues sabemos que la mayoría de migrantes salen de sus países por el problema de la pobreza. Los obliga a salir. Creo que esto sí es muy importante tomarlo en cuenta para entender que no solamente es un asunto, diríamos, de la sociología o un asunto también de la antropología, sino que hay una situación humana que llega al límite cuando la gente no tiene otra alternativa más que decir, bueno, dejo todo y me voy a otro país para poder así encontrar una nueva manera de vivir. Yo mismo he experimentado en mi familia, porque mi familia migró a Estados Unidos cuando yo comenzaba mis estudios en el seminario, y entendí entonces lo duro que fue para mi madre y mis hermanos. Mi papá no migró. Dejar el país para llegar a Estados Unidos sin conocer el idioma, sin tener la oferta de un trabajo fijo, y sin embargo, pues tener que salir de Guatemala porque la situación de pobreza que afectaba a mi familia era muy grande. Creo que sí vale la pena seguir repitiendo que es cierto, todos tenemos derecho a migrar, pero en el mensaje que escucharemos el próximo domingo, el Papa también dirá que lo mejor es no migrar. Es lo mejor, es lo ideal. Pero ¿hasta dónde? Yo pienso ahora en mi familia. ¿Qué hubiera pasado si mi familia no hubiera migrado a Estados Unidos? Mis hermanos no hubieran tenido la educación que tuvieron, no hubieran podido organizar la vida de su familia como ahora la tienen organizada. Es decir, se abrieron perspectivas nuevas para ellos cuando se abrió la oportunidad de emigrar gracias al esfuerzo, en este caso, que mi madre había hecho. Fue la primera que se fue y que abrió el camino. Y estoy hablando en ese sentido de cientos de miles de familias que migran precisamente porque el propio país no les da todo aquello que merecen. Y aquí entraríamos a un tema que creo que vale la pena redimensionarlo, y es el tema de cómo las mismas estructuras sociales y económicas, en este caso hablo de Guatemala, y puedo decir en general de América Central, las estructuras sociales no favorecen realmente bienestar para todos y todas. Y ahora creo que la perspectiva de enfrentar el fenómeno de la migración debe de tener también esta parte propositiva, es decir, enfrentar por qué nuestros países, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, etcétera, por qué nuestros países no dan lo que deberían de dar, capacidades, posibilidades de trabajo, salarios muy buenos, sistemas sociales de protección para los más indefensos, atención a los jóvenes. ¿Por qué no lo hacen? Si hubiera realmente reformas fundamentales en nuestros sistemas económicos, hablo a nivel de América Central, creo que eso ayudaría mucho a disminuir la migración. No estoy hablando de los que tienen que salir de sus países porque los quieren matar, porque están siendo perseguidos políticamente. Me estoy centrando más en el tipo de migración que tiene raíces económicas, que tiene la raíz de la pobreza sistémica y sistemática que existe en el país como Guatemala, en la marginación tradicional de los que han sido siempre considerados pobres y por lo tanto marginados y aislados. Bueno, es lo que quiero compartir desde la propia experiencia de mi familia. Mi propia familia pues vino desde Italia, mis antepasados, porque también en Italia en el siglo XIX, mitad del siglo XIX, había una situación de grande pobreza, y eso explica también la migración hacia Estados Unidos de italianos, de franceses, de irlandeses, alemanes. Es decir, el ciclo se repite. Pobreza empuja a la gente a salir de su país, a buscar horizontes nuevos, logran reconstruir su vida en un país que les ofrece las oportunidades, pero, y esto es también lo que quiero compartir, llama la atención que generaciones de tercera o cuarta generación de migrantes se han olvidado muchas veces de dónde vienen y se vuelven egoístas con sus propios paisanos. Es lo que estoy viendo, por ejemplo, en esas declaraciones que dio el gobernador de Florida, que tiene antecedentes de descendencia italiana y sin embargo está siendo muy duro con los migrantes que llegan a la Florida. Bueno, es lo que quiero compartir. Al final, todo se resuelve aquí en lo profundo de la conciencia cuando nos olvidamos de la enseñanza del Señor Jesús. Yo fui un forastero y tú me atendiste. O cuando el mismo Señor dirá que sí, que Él se identifica con los hambrientos, con los que no tienen oportunidades de una vida digna, y cuando también él mismo dirá: lo que le hiciste a uno de estos hermanos míos o hermanas, pues a mí me lo hiciste. Creo que tenemos de verdad que insistir en esa dimensión de la urgencia que los cristianos tenemos de descubrir en el otro, en el migrante, en el empobrecido, en el abandonado, en el descartado, como ha dicho tantas veces el Papa Francisco, a nuestro Señor Jesucristo. Si desde la fe cristiana no enfrentamos y enfocamos este tema de la migración como otros temas desde esta perspectiva, creo que será más difícil el compromiso solidario y sobre todo, pues estaremos dando un antitestimonio.
Thank you very much, Cardinal Ramazzini. Your family story, your perspective is so important. And I was struck by your reference to have the ways in which poverty, in which the capacity of a local country or local community to provide for the needs of people is one of the drivers of migration. And I think that when we think about poverty as an expression of violence, that which is harming the well-being of people, preventing them from the fullness of life, I think it points even more clearly to the move away from that as an expression of violence. I was also struck by the need for a globalization that is a globalization of justice, a nonviolent globalization for justice and for creating the ability for all countries to provide for the needs of people living within their borders. So thank you very much. I would like to invite others. Feel free to raise your hand, your either physically, if that's easier, or your emoji hand. If you would like to speak, feel free to respond to what you heard, to what Cardinal Ramassini said, to what you heard from Ken or Gina and Scott or Nicholas, but also simply to share your own stories. And I may call on you if we have a lull in the conversation. So would someone like to begin? Well, I would perhaps invite if Carlos Marintas, if you're still with us, or Padre Mello. Yes, please go ahead. Padre Mello, and then Carlos.
Hola, hola, muy buenos días, un saludo, un abrazo desde el espíritu con ustedes. Aquí estoy en un área rural, pero trato de comunicarme con ustedes, escuchándoles. Yo quiero decir unas cositas así breves sobre la base de lo que he escuchado y del marco de lo que tenemos aquí en este evento, que es ver la migración desde la no violencia. Y es que yo quiero decir que el fenómeno de la migración tiene una base que lo sustenta, y es una dinámica estructural de violencia. La migración tiene en su origen una estructura que es provocadora y dinamizadora de violencia y la expulsa de muy diversas maneras a las poblaciones a huir. Y eso es violencia. Sin embargo, ¿cuál es la respuesta en general de la población migrante? Es una respuesta de generosidad. Yo cuando he ido a los Estados Unidos o incluso he ido a España, ¿con qué me encuentro? Con unas familias migrantes de puertas abiertas, con una enorme generosidad. Es decir, la respuesta de la población migrante en su conjunto es no violenta, pero a su vez también la población migrante que emigra para hacer el bien, para buscar trabajo. No van a ejercer violencia, salvo excepciones, pero en conjunto van a fomentar el trabajo, a dar ejemplo de trabajo, a dar testimonio de trabajo, y a dar testimonio también de generosidad. Cuando yo voy a Estados Unidos y me encuentro con hondureños y hondureñas, siempre lo acogen a uno con la baleada que uno se come aquí. O si uno se encuentra con familias salvadoreñas, se va a encontrar también con las pupusas aquí en Estados Unidos o en España. Es decir, la población que emigra por razones de un sistema violento y que los expulsa, responde con generosidad, responde con trabajo y responde haciendo el bien, con generosidad. Y eso creo yo que es algo que tenemos que hacerlo. Yo, por ejemplo, vengo de familias migrantes. Primero mi familia emigró por parte de mi madre, emigró de El Salvador. Mi padre del sur del país, yo estoy en la costa norte hondureña, en el Valle de Sula, emigró del sur movida por las bananeras, para trabajar en las bananeras. Las bananeras explotó a las familias, de manera que mis hermanos mayores, soy el menor de los hermanos, cuando fueron expulsados de las bananeras, tuvieron que agarrar el camino al norte, y desde allá continúan tratando mantienen su fe, mantienen su generosidad y se mantienen haciendo el bien. Creo yo que esa es la no violencia. La respuesta en general nuestra, y con esto voy a cerrar, es presionar al gobierno, por ejemplo, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, que también responda haciendo el bien. No valen los muros, no valen las respuestas represivas, no valen la radicalización de leyes antimigrantes. Lo que tendría que valer es que el gobierno de los Estados Unidos pueda responder con programas en base a un alto porcentaje de la riqueza que producen nuestros migrantes. Si nuestros migrantes producen riqueza para promover el desarrollo y aportar al desarrollo de los Estados Unidos, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos debía devolver un buen porcentaje de esa riqueza que producen los migrantes para que se promueva el desarrollo aquí en tres grandes temas, que son los que provocan la expulsión: temas agrarios, temas ambientales y temas de derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Father Mello. Powerful, so true. Thank you. Violence in many places met with generosity and nonviolence. Carlos, would you like to speak? Thank you for being with us.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días, hermanas y hermanos. Me voy a permitir hablar en español en vista que tenemos una traducción muy buena. En febrero de este año, en El Paso, Texas, muy cerca de una iglesia del Sagrado Corazón, había un grupo grande de familias de migrantes. Hacía mucho frío, estaba como a 36 grados Fahrenheit. Y me topé con un migrante que había hecho la travesía desde Colombia y cargaba a su niña, una niña, yo creo que sería de unos 6 meses de edad, y la niña estaba temblando, no paraba de temblar. Y le pregunté al papá, dije, ¿qué le pasa a su niña? Está temblando y no para de temblar. Y me decía que cuando había salido de su tierra, la niña tenía 2 meses, era una bebé. En el trayecto se perdió la esposa, se perdió algunos otros hijos de la familia y solamente llegó él solo con su niña a la frontera. Cuando llegó a la frontera del Paso, de Ciudad Juárez, El Paso, la niña ya habían pasado 2 meses. En el trayecto de su tierra hacia El Paso, la niña ya había pasado 2 meses sufriendo muchas cosas que entristecen el alma y el corazón. Y le dije yo, pues hay un lugar donde puede ir para que la niña no esté sufriendo el frío y pare de temblar y puede tener un lugar calientito donde acogerse. Y me dice el joven padre, me dice, bueno, no solamente es el frío por el que está temblando, también es el miedo. Algo muy desgarrador. La trayectoria de las familias de migrantes, las mismas causas porque muchísimos salen de sus tierras, es por la violencia sistemática que padecen. Desafortunadamente, cuando llegan a Estados Unidos, se encuentran en una nación donde pareciera que se ha sentado una cultura de la violencia. Y esa violencia estructural que los hizo, que forzó, que los desplazó, la encuentran en este país. El Paso y Ciudad Juárez hoy en día son el símbolo más claro de la violencia del sistema en contra de las y los migrantes. Y aquí hay personas en esta conversación, personas que lo ven diariamente o que en sus visitas se han dado cuenta de cómo la respuesta de Estados Unidos y particularmente del gobernador de Texas para contener la migración es una estrategia de guerra. Estamos en guerra en contra de las y los migrantes. El río está lleno de tanquetas, de Hummers, de guardias, tropas de la Guardia Nacional, de soldados, de tropas estatales y hasta en una parte del sur de Nuevo México de grupos paramilitares extremistas. Entonces, el desafío y el dilema que tenemos es cómo podemos promover la paz, lo que nos hablaba el Papa Francisco, de una paz duradera que esté basada en la justicia social, que esté basada en el respeto a nuestra casa común. Y en este sentido, yo creo que lo que sí hay que destacar de esta supuesta crisis de la migración, como le llaman los gobernantes a todos los niveles, lo que se destaca es la solidaridad de la población hacia las y los migrantes. En las caravanas, no han sido los gobiernos por donde atravesan los migrantes quienes se han preocupado por su integridad, por asegurar que no son atacados tanto por el crimen organizado como por los mismos instrumentos del poder público, represivos, la Guardia Nacional de México. Si no ha sido la población y la población pobre la que se ha solidarizado con estas caravanas, con estas familias de desposeídos, como bien nos decía un padre, estos no hay que llamarlos pobres, hay que llamarlos desposeídos, porque la razón por la que están pobres es porque les quitaron todo, porque el sistema les despojó de todos, hasta de la capacidad de quedarse y vivir en sus tierras. Y en este sentido, y recordando las palabras del cardenal Ramazzini, pues me recuerda que yo he sido bendecido de participar en 4 encuentros de los movimientos populares con el Papa, y cómo él, en todos los mensajes que nos ha dado, nos ha hablado de la creación de una cultura de la solidaridad. Y yo pienso que el reto que tenemos, si verdaderamente pensamos que hay que crear una paz duradera, que hay que inclusive identificar esa violencia encubierta que se da en los Estados Unidos, donde tenemos a los refugiados, a los migrantes, a las familias, moviéndolas de un refugio a otro sin darle solución a las causas, a los problemas que orillan esta migración, este desplazamiento humano. Pues la construcción de una solidaridad, una cultura de solidaridad. Pero también el Papa Francisco nos ha dicho que los gestos esporádicos de solidaridad no son que tenemos que ir más allá de eso, que tenemos que empezar a trastocar las causas estructurales que están provocando el sufrimiento de tantos millares de personas. A mí, en lo particular, me llena de esperanza ver cómo son las pobres y los pobres de las zonas fronterizas los que han buscado la forma de solidarizarse, de acoger a las y a los migrantes. Hace poco las autoridades de Ciudad Juárez estaban muy preocupadas porque había un campamento con muchas carpas, no sé, eran como 70 o 100 tiendas de campaña alineadas en las orillas del río Bravo, que es lo que divide a Ciudad Juárez del Paso. Y esas tiendas de campaña no las trajo la Cruz Roja, ni los gobiernos, nadie. Esas tienditas de campaña las empezó a comprar la población pobre de Ciudad Juárez para llevárselas a los migrantes, para que tuvieran un modo de guarecerse de los climas tan extremos que padecemos en esta frontera. Así que yo pienso y me da mucha esperanza el saber que estamos en el camino de la construcción de una solidaridad, de una cultura de solidaridad que es genuina y que en cierto modo está ocupando ese vacío que hay no solamente entre las instituciones públicas, pero en ciertos sectores de la población norteamericana donde no hay una total indiferencia hacia el sufrimiento humano. En El Paso y Ciudad Juárez estamos haciendo todo lo que podemos para fomentar esa cultura de solidaridad, porque es lo moralmente correcto, pero también porque esa es nuestra principal responsabilidad como personas de fe. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So much to think about in what you shared. I think bottom line being the culture of solidarity, the gift of solidarity that so often people who are themselves impoverished or marginalized offer to others who arrive moving away from violence or poverty. I think so many important lessons for all of us can be learned from migrants and from those who are impoverished themselves. I also was struck by what you said about the importance of addressing that isolated actions will not be enough, that we need to be working together. We need to organize ourselves to change the structures that are either causing migration or preventing a just arrival when people arrive in a new country, most particularly the United States. So thank you so much to think about and to say, and I invite others to reflect as well. You see, I wonder if Carla might like to share a bit. Carla, I know that could you introduce your colleague who is with you? We're happy to have you both. And then if you'd like to share with us a bit about your own reaction to what you've heard and from your very rich experience in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, what does this sound like to you? Welcome to both of you. Thank you.
Gracias pelo convite. Nosotros estamos en dupla porque achamos muy importante participar de esta reunião, não? Primeiro que aqui em São Paulo, no Brasil, não é diferente de nada que vocês estão falando. E é muito triste saber que nós estamos passando por momentos tão parecidos e que ainda falta muito da Igreja, principalmente católica, trabalhar forte com todas as pessoas que frequentam a Igreja, porque há muito tempo vem se alejando de las personas. aqui no Brasil principalmente, não? Então, claro que ainda é a igreja que mais trabalha para os imigrantes, pero aqui com o poder de extrema direita saiu de todas as pessoas que já havia ali o mal. Então, nós só dizemos que legitimou, não? Legitimou a maldade das pessoas. Então, é muito complicado aqui que muitos padres, bispos, que são da extrema direita e que não apoiam os migrantes. É muito triste, não? Então, creio que a casa comum ainda falta para estar como casa comum, não? Então, nós temos muitos tipos de migração. Por exemplo, agora, o afegão. Abre-se o país para receber as pessoas, pero não tienes condições para isso, não? Então, qual que é o destino? Passo o Brasil e depois vou para os Estados Unidos. E não importa como, não? Se vamos ter filhos, se vamos ter plata, não importa. É importante chegar, pero nem sempre chegam, não? Nós temos muitas pessoas que vão para o caminho da morte. Então, escuchar tudo isso que vocês estão dizendo, ainda falta também a comunidade muito conhecimento, muito, não? Do que é a migração, de que é ser migrante em outro país. Então, para nós é sempre uma violência. Migrar muitas vezes se torna uma violência. E desde do seu lugar de origem até o lugar de chegada. O caminho, muitas vezes, principalmente para a questão de gênero, não? As mulheres, em especial, grande maioria sofre violência, não? Às vezes com trata, às vezes violências sexuais, às vezes lhe quitam os filhos ou usam os filhos para que possam ter algum benefício em troca. Então, é muito triste a realidade de nós se pensarmos em violência, não? Entonces,
bueno, muy buenos días. Yo me llamo Roque. Quien habló fue Carla. Somos coordinadores de una institución llamada CAMI, Centro de Apoyo y Pastoral del Migrante. Bueno, existimos desde 2005 y nacimos exactamente para apoyar inmigrantes y refugiados en Brasil. ¿Cómo veo un poco esta situación? Bueno, el migrante cuando deja su país tiene doble sentimiento, uno de fe, que voy a alcanzar mis sueños, no me interesa lo que voy a encontrar por el camino, lo más importante es llegar, lo más importante es reempezar la vida, y junto con esto el miedo. Siempre acompañan los inmigrantes la fe y el miedo, porque todo lo que van a hacer saben que algún riesgo hay por acompañar este camino que están haciendo. Entonces, este doble sentimiento acompaña desde la violencia de origen. Entonces, son muchas las violencias por las cuales salen de sus países. Tránsito, entonces, en cuanto están en camino. Y por último, también el destino. Porque el destino es el lugar donde ellos sueñan de ser felices. Y al contrario, muchas veces llegando al destino, ahí son discriminados, ahí pasan por xenofobia, ahí pasan por otras complicaciones mayores de los que ya pasaron por el camino o en la origen. Y eso se lleva tiempo hasta que consigan incluirse dentro de la nueva sociedad, sea por el idioma, sea por la cultura, sea porque extrañan todo el nuevo que ahí está. Bueno, yo sé que todos conocen esto. Esta historia es común para todos. Tenemos muchos casos aquí que en CAMI acompañamos. Por ejemplo, tenemos una persona que está trabajando con nosotros hoy día que fue víctima de trata de personas. Tenemos una persona que fue víctima de violencia doméstica. Tenemos una persona que fue víctima de trabajo esclavo. Entonces, ¿qué hacemos? No es solamente ser solidario con estas personas, pero darles una oportunidad. Estas personas, si no estuvieran con nosotros, tal vez serían revictimizadas, estarían otra vez en el mercado de la explotación humana. Entonces, como institución, nosotros buscamos sí, acoger a estas personas, pero también incluirlas dentro de las posibilidades de alcanzar sus sueños. Entonces, prácticamente por año hemos apoyado más o menos como 30.000 personas como institución. Y apoyamos con, primer paso, documentación, porque sin documento no existo. Así dicen ellos y así es la realidad. Después, apoyamos con servicio social y asesoría jurídica, porque ellos saben que llegando aquí pueden hacer denuncias, pueden encontrar un abrazo amigo, pueden encontrar una palabra amiga, pueden encontrar lo que necesitan para, de alguna manera, lo que están necesitando en aquel momento. Después, tenemos cursos como portugués, emprendedorismo, tenemos modelaje, que es una manera de esta persona ser incluida dentro del mercado de trabajo. También tenemos un trabajo de base que es directamente en las casas de los inmigrantes. Aquí tenemos un sistema de explotación bastante grande que es dentro de la cadena textil, para donde viene la mayoría de los inmigrantes de los países vecinos.
Son más de 20.000.
Son sí, más de 20.000 talleres de costura. Y la gran mayoría de ellos están en la informalidad. Entonces, siempre en una situación de debilidad, de vulnerabilidad, y listos para ser explotados, porque este es el sistema. Bueno, además de esto, también hacemos trabajo con mujeres inmigrantes en 10 barrios, donde juntamos ahí las mujeres y ahí presentamos todas las políticas públicas que existen en beneficio de ellas, y también buscamos de apoyar contra las violencias que sufren estas mujeres. Y también los niños dentro de los talleres de costura.
Son 456 mujeres
Thank you.
y 1.210 hijos de estas mujeres.
Sí. Entonces, para nosotros, estar participando de una reunión como hoy día es bastante importante porque entendemos que no estamos solitos. Y lo mismo, creo que sería importante cada uno también sentirse así. Hay una red de explotación, sí. Hay una red de violencia, sí. Pero también hay una red que defiende la vida, que está ahí exactamente para hacer el contrario de lo que hacen los que explotan. Entonces, tal vez, como idea, primero, acoger a estas personas de una manera que se sientan parte de la iglesia, se sientan parte de la comunidad, se sientan parte con cosas simples. Yo cuando trabajaba como sacerdote en Estados Unidos, todos los domingos presentaba a las nuevas personas y buscaba en las familias quién podría acoger a estas personas en sus casas para ayudarlas. Y ahí ayudar con un trabajo. Lo mismo hice en Río de Janeiro, aquí en San Pablo. Entonces, son pequeñas cosas que se pueden hacer. Otra cosa que se puede desarrollar institucionalmente, una red de protección para estas personas inmigrantes y refugiadas. Y ahí se trabaja juntos la iglesia de los diversos países. Por ejemplo, Centroamérica, nosotros aquí mandamos mucha gente para arriba, no mandamos, van solitos, ¿no? Hacia el norte. Entonces, durante este camino, estas personas sufren muchas violencias y necesitan el apoyo en las fronteras, especialmente en las fronteras, para encontrar una acogida e información de cómo va a ser el resto del camino, porque la migración tiene que ser libre. Por último, solo decir que aquí tenemos en la pared de nuestra institución está escrito libres con derechos en cualquier lugar del mundo. Esto. Gracias.
Wonderful.
Gracias.
Thank you both very much. And you're obviously doing wonderful work. So many of the people participating in this roundtable are engaging in the same way that you are. And in my understanding, it is the very heart of nonviolence to respond to the violence that people are experiencing, both as migrants, but also as allies and those who are accompanying migrants. So thank you very much. We're just a reminder that we are continuing the conversation with the sort of basic question being, what insights on gospel nonviolence flow from your own experiences and stories? And just as we sort of think about that a little bit more, I'd perhaps ask Leo Guardado, would you be willing to say a word from your experience as a migrant yourself, and who has now been reflecting very deeply on that experience?
Sure, thank you, Marie. And I'll weave, to make this shorter, my experience, but really more maybe theological reflection, and I think ecclesiological reflection, because that's where I think we need to move. So, y disculpen, voy a hablar en inglés en otro momento, quizás en español. So my mother and I had to flee El Salvador during the Civil War in 1991, and we walked essentially to Tijuana, crossed through Mexico and Guatemala. My experience of what happens on the journey is one of mutual aid in order to survive. The things that happen in the US or in Brazil or in El Salvador about mutual aid societies where communities are rebuilt from the bottom up is in fact what happens among migrants in order to survive and to at times thrive on the journey. I want to say that I'm going to shift a little here maybe into some bigger picture things. Gandhi, who is at the core of so much of nonviolence talk in the modern world, really believed in the constructive program. You rebuild society, you rebuild modernity by rebuilding at that micro level, human relationships, social cohesion, trust, education, immediate needs. Medellin, in the Documents on Peace especially, talks about that. Paul VI was referenced here, Pablo VI. Paul VI admired Gandhi, and it echoes Gandhi there about the constructive program, obras constructivas, he says, that discourse he gave in Colombia in 1968, right before Medellin. So as we think about poverty and people forced to migrate, we also have to think about what happens in the midst of the forced migration, which is societies being rebuilt from the ground up in micro levels. The real question is, does the church, we the church, because migrants are also church, but since this is a Catholic kind of audience, do we the church have the capacity to respond to the call that is present in forced migration, to rethink church, structures of church? And as Medellin says, and I think a lot, we have to go back to Medellin, as Medellin says, yes, it's individual conversion, but it's also conversion of structures, and the two go together, the macro and the micro. Or as I think Romero would say, are we willing to have violence done to ourselves? La violencia del amor, the violence of love, the only violence that Romero allows for, that harsh self-suffering, that Gandhi would say, so that I can have a radical conversion away from my addiction to violence. I want to weave a little more here. As Carlos mentioned, that really it's a war against migrants that's taking place globally. I'm going to add it's a war against the poor. Yes, poor migrants. And as long as we justify war, we're also finding ways of justifying poverty. The two go together. I think we have to hold the two together. If this is in fact a war against migrants, it's also a war against the poor. And we've been at chipping away as a church, theologically, pastorally, like poverty has real poverty, that being in proximity to death has no place within the gospel. And so we have to, I think, continue to frame the structural poverty that drives migration in all its ways with the lens of war, because then that is the link, I believe, to the lens of nonviolence, especially in the sense of reconstructing from the bottom up a constructive program that invites us into the deep, painful, awful conversion. I was struck at the beginning, maybe I'll end with this, of the slides, there was an image of Oscar Romero, and the words on top said something about guarding or protecting el proceso de liberación de nuestro pueblo, the process of liberation of our people. Emphasis on the process. Migration is a process that undoes structures, forced structures that kill. And so it's a process of liberation, I'm going to say, then also salvation, then also of healing. De sanación, salvación, liberación. They all go together. Healing not only the micro wounds, the violences we endure, the rejections, the many reasons why people leave, but also those macro wounds of modernity, of nation states, of the 56 incursions that were shown in a slide at the beginning. Those are wounds of modernity that we have to keep in mind as we think of salvation. So maybe I'll end there. I'm a theologian. I work on migration. I'll just say, I think about sanctuary. That's where my work goes. Comunidades de Santuario, Iglesias Santuario. My book is coming out in December called Church as Sanctuary. How do we rethink being church as sanctuary? So I'm very much at the nexus of this in terms of Gandhian philosophy. And for time, I can't keep going, but I think all of this is a theological question, more than sociological, as we've said, of poverty, than this kind of violence or this migration as a theological question. I just want to keep coming back to that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leo. A very important perspective. Please don't stop there. Please keep the conversation going. I wonder if Sister Krista would want to say a word now. You have such rich experience on the border. What are you thinking about all of this?
Thank you so much. It's a gift to be with you and to be part of this conversation. So I'm third generation Mexican American. I was born on the U.S.-Mexico border, Bisbee, Arizona, small pueblo town, and I feel I'm acutely aware of my privilege because for the last 4 years I've lived in at the El Paso Juarez border on the El Paso side, and crossing over the bridge every day, I'm just so aware of the privilege and how we don't have any control over where we're born. Had I been born 10 minutes further south in Mexico, my life would have been very, very different. And as I'm accompanying people, I now live in Ciudad Juarez at a shelter, and I'm aware of it. I am on sacred ground every day, and I'm aware of the people that we welcome into our space. I'm aware that we have so much to learn from our siblings, our families that are arriving. We mostly accompany women and children, and we hear a lot of stories. Our model is based on Pope Francis's invitation to welcome, to protect, to promote human dignity, and to integrate our families that are arriving. And what really stood out to me was in Nicholas Paz's presentation when he shared about the call, it's not as an escape, but as a courageous, nonviolent action to confront violence. That really struck me because when I hear the stories of our families, it's a miracle that they are with us. It's a miracle that I get to see them face to face because of all of the trauma that each person has suffered. One of our moms recently, she arrived from Venezuela. Her son was killed by a gang, 16-year-old, and the gang was also after her. I saw her act as a disruption of violence by being so courageous to be able to flee from Venezuela, as thousands and thousands of people are fleeing for all kinds of reasons, but the political instability, the state of the country, not even being able to afford food, milk for children. There are many children who are malnourished right now. And then taking the risk of going through multiple countries, especially the Darien Gap, and encountering all of the suffering that our families go through through that just awful journey through the Darien Gap, walking through the jungle, encountering people who have died, the smell of people who have died. So many of our families have that same story, the risks that they take going through the river, almost drowning, seeing people who have drowned, drinking water where there's a person who died in the river of the same water that they're drinking. As they arrived to us, they arrived really beaten up physically, mentally, emotionally. And the word courage continues to stand out to me. The word faith continues to stand out to me because it took so much courage for our families to arrive to us. Also in Mexico, Guerrero, Zacatecas, Michoacan, we hear a lot of stories of the cartel violence and the way that the cartels are destroying the fabrics of the community and the violence that is taking place in so many areas in Mexico. One of our moms that arrived to us, her son was kidnapped and burnt to death by a cartel, and his pregnant wife as well. Her other daughter, also her husband was kidnapped, killed. And 3 years later, she remarried, and her second husband was also killed, kidnapped by a cartel and killed. And this family had the courage to disrupt the violence of being the next victims of this cartel and fleeing to Juarez. And they arrived to us. It resonated what you said about the two things. Someone said about the holding faith and also fear, that those are two real emotions that our families carry with them. And I have so much to share, but I want to hear from everyone else. So thank you for listening to me and for letting me be a part of this conversation. God bless.
Thank you, Sister. Thank you, Sister Krista. Such wonderful, deep thoughts from your very important experience. Heidi Soneka, would you like to say a word if you can join us from the Camino?
I can. Let me know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just have to start. Thank you so much. I mean, my mind is just kind of blown by all the different thoughts and reflections and the ways that we can work with this. And I have to start by saying, Krista, that last story you told just reminds me of Naomi and Ruth, right? And them going because they believed, and Ruth saying, where you go, I'm going. What a beautiful story. And I guess I speak more from those who work with people in these situations, like Krista spoke. And I think, and a few from clients, like I think of one client who walked from Honduras, and I asked her, well, what did you eat while you were walking through Mexico? And she just kind of rolled her eyes at me and she said, there's always somebody to give you something to eat. And that's what I keep hearing right now, is the solidarity. But I feel really challenged by the reminder that it's not enough to do it in small bits. For me, the big question of nonviolence at our level, at the border level, is resistance to violence. I mean, it's saying people migrate as an act of resistance to violence. It's saying people suffer horrible things in country of origin and on the route, and they stop to care for other people. They resist the violence that happens to them, and they resist selling out or buying into that as a way of life. And I think we who work at the borders also resist violence in all those different ways, right? I don't just have clients, we have relationships with the people that we're working with. And we resist all the rhetoric that we hear that tells us, who's right and who's wrong and who has power and who doesn't. And I think our challenge as church really for me is both the macro and the micro. And I'm super grateful that I work on a team and that there's all of us doing different types of work in different places. We don't all have to do it all. And I guess the last thing is just to say, the challenge to each of us, as somebody said in the very beginning, to resist violence, even in the ways that our societies right now try to tell us that, you're with me or against me, you're my side or the other side, you're good or bad. And that we keep resisting that because as people of faith, that's not how we believe, right? We believe that everybody has value and everybody has to be part of this. I already forgot it, but this greater human family, and so how do we build that? I listened to Ken and I was like, why wouldn't everybody want that? Why wouldn't everybody want what we're talking about? So adelante, there's a lot more work to do. Thanks, Marie, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Heidi. There is a lot more work to do. Maybe just I would invite any of you, including Jean and Scott and Ken and Nicholas and others who've spoken, to maybe what would you say? Most of you are working in some way as part of the church, the people of God, the church at an institutional level. The church is involved in many ways, responding to the needs of migrants and working for justice in immigration. What more could the church be doing to help us break into a new way of thinking, just as Heidi was suggesting, a new way of moving beyond the violences that so bind us into a new space? What more could the Catholic Church be doing? Church institutionally, the church as the people of God, all of us. How do we move from the individual to the structural? How do we learn? How do we move into a new way of being that I think is described by nonviolence? Just any thoughts about that? And I would just invite you to raise your hand or wave your hand or do whatever is the easiest. Or any just additions to what you'd said. Yeah, Leo.
I think we need to reread Ecclesia in America. We are one church of the continent. If my notion of church, I live in North America, in the United States, but I'm born in El Salvador. I'm Latino, Latin American. If my notion of church ends where the nation state ends and another nation state begins, then my ministry is bounded by that imposition, that historical reality. I'm not saying that nation states shouldn't exist. That's a different conversation. But if my ministry or my fidelity ends there and now like the rest can do on the other side something, then I think I'm failing to understand the borderless invitation of being church. And that raises a lot of questions about what kind of ministry we're willing to do or not to do. How are we willing to accompany people across borders? In the 1980s, people accompanied across borders. Yes, we could say illegally. Lives were saved. I'm here because churches provided sanctuary. And so my mom and I were able to benefit from that. So I think we have to rethink how we identify as a church of the United States or a church of Mexico versus like a church that happens to be located in the United States, but it's not demarcated by the nation state. So that's a ways of thinking. I think that's a kind of conversion that we'll also have to undergo, how we think about church and nation state. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Yes, Scott.
I just wanted to lift up in terms of an answer, those powerful stories that Krista spoke of migrants coming to the Darien Gap, the whole migrant journey, and also Carlos Marentes. I just, people have referred back to Romero, and I think in two senses that was on his T-shirt, but it's from his homily. Hay que cambiar de raíz todo el sistema. And I think it's also, we have to not only change systems, but allow our hearts to be changed in that encounter with the passion of the migrant journey and the migrants and the border. I think in that encounter, there's a sense this should not be. People should not suffer like this. And then the awareness, but they are suffering because of the way the world is ordered and constructed. And so we have a responsibility, our hearts, to move our hearts in such a way that we know this should not be. We are different people. That will move us to solidarity, and hopefully together with the migrants and the people and countries from which they come, to change those structures of violence.
Thank you, Scott. Any other thoughts before we wrap this up? Jean, yes.
Yes, for the U.S. Church, I would love to see more of a public voice to say, stop this anti-immigrant hate speech. I mean, that the church has done beautiful work receiving immigrants in parishes. There's nothing to take away from that. But our culture, we've been speaking a lot about culture and the culture of nonviolence, the culture of solidarity, just to have that public voice of to switch the narrative. I mean, I'm struck within this call the number of people who talked about the solidarity of migrants for survival. I mean, this country is so devoid of values like that we need those values in this country. Thank goodness, it's enriching our country and those values of faith. I mean, where are parishes blossoming in many of the Latino parish neighborhoods? The culture of looking out for each other. That we are starved, I think, in this country of those kind of values that we see in those who have suffered to get here, who just have a whole lot to teach us. It's not worth taking care of migrants, but minimally we should be challenging those who try to blame them, and also realizing that we are blessed as well.
Thank you, Jean. And yes, I think Carla and Roque also spoke about that some of the challenges in Brazil. I think it's true, we see it happening in Europe, that we are not always receptive to the gift of immigrants in our societies. Any other last? Yes, Ken.
So I'm so grateful to have heard all of these testimonies and witnesses, and from my own social location in the United States, the importance of owning up to the structural violence that my country imposes around the world, including throughout Latin America. I would say that the greatest social movement in human history is coming. Why? Because it has to address the kind of injustice that we've heard today, and that nonviolent resistance against these structures is critical. But I would also say that kind of change of heart and change of structure is evident in all of the witnesses, theological, pastoral, individual, and collective, that you have all shared here. You are on the front lines of that movement. We will not make it through the 21st century unless that movement of movements is not happening across the world. And I take hope from the nonviolent witnesses we've been really privileged to receive today. And I would finally say, if the church could play a role even more than it is in leading us, in calling on us as people of faith to become those nonviolent witnesses. I would say that's not being done enough yet, and that's where I live. That 50 years from now we could look back and say, oh, the church rose to the occasion. But we're hearing how you as church have done so. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. And yes, for sure, you as church are doing so. It's interesting to realize that Pope Francis is about to go to Marseille to make a statement inviting the church, the people of God, to follow in some way. So will we do that? In his new book entitled, I Ask You in the Name of God, 10 Prayers for a Future of Hope, His Holiness quotes Martin Luther King, who said, it is no longer a question of choosing between violence and nonviolence, but between nonviolence and non-existence. Then Pope Francis says, the choice is up to us. In this roundtable, in this webinar, we have received the gift of really powerful examples of the nonviolent way Pope Francis is calling us to embrace, away from the threat of non-existence to the fullness of life at the core of the gospel nonviolence. This webinar and other roundtable webinars will be available on the Pax Christi YouTube channel. Please share this link with others. We'll send you that link in the next day or so, and help us shine the light on a nonviolent way forward. We thank you, all of you who participated. Each one of you brought the gift of yourselves, the gift of your experience and your wisdom. And we hope that this conversation, this reflection will continue. This particular roundtable was focused in the Americas. We do hope in the future to have a similar conversation on migration and immigration in Africa and in Europe. And we hope that it will deepen and continue as we've begun it here. Continue the conversations in your own communities, and please share with us what you're learning, what are your insights. We really do hope that this will be an ongoing conversation. If you could just take a minute at the end of this, or you'll get the link again tomorrow, to take a few minutes to respond to the survey that will help us see how we can do this better. Of special thanks to our interpreters, Belen and Blanca, who helped us communicate with each other well. And let us just end with a very brief prayer. God, our Father and Mother, loving source and destiny of all life, we praise you and thank you through our Lord Jesus Christ. The nonviolent Christ is your faithful servant, our brother, who brings peace to our broken world through his new commandment of love and his confrontation with the powers of evil and injustice. Through Christ's self-emptying love, our swords are transformed into plowshares, our hostility into reconciliation, our alienation into community, and our hatred into forgiveness of our enemies. Your Spirit changes our hearts. Enemies begin to speak to one another. Those who were estranged joined hands in friendship, and nations seek the way of peace together. The Spirit of the nonviolent Christ is at work when understanding puts an end to strife, when hatred is overcome by mercy, and when revenge gives way to forgiveness. For the gift of this transforming love, we never cease to thank and praise you, Almighty God. Amen. And that was from the preface of the Eucharist of Gospel Nonviolence. So thank you all so much for being with us today. We look forward to a continued conversation. Be well.